Hello, and welcome to the Washington Courts Report podcast. I'm your host, Patric Haerle, and for today's episode, we're focusing on Second Chance Month, which takes place each April and is dedicated to supporting the successful reentry of individuals with criminal records and reducing the barriers formerly incarcerated individuals face. To discuss this, I'm excited to be joined by Yvonne Jones, a Senior Court Program Analyst with the Administrative Office of the Courts. Yvonne, thanks for coming on the show and talking with us about this.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
Yeah, so just to get started a little bit, your current work is actually focused more on pretrial services, but you do have pretty extensive experience with reentry and reentry programs. Could you give us just a brief summary of your experience working with reentry programs?
Absolutely. Early career, I worked with reentry programs as an agency, and my role there was doing sentencing services. So the role required that I do interviews and just help to create a recommendation for the judge when it was time for an individual to come home to see if they would approve those recommendations. So as a transition plan back into the community, whether it was interviewing their family members to see about appropriate housing, job leads, social work, physical health, but just making sure the court knew that they weren't just going to release them, but our job was to help create the plan for the release. And back then it was called sentencing services. And then throughout the years, worked in the same departments or alongside other professionals that remain specific to the reentry space. I've always worked in programs that were community-based supervision, justice involved. So that's been my career in a nutshell for 20 years, sometimes in the reentry specific lane and sometimes parallel to it.
Okay, and we are glad to have you on to talk about, Second Chance Month. You have extensive experience, and it's kind of fitting, going from the reentry side to now the pretrial side. You're getting both ends of the spectrum there, getting people ready and getting people, prepared to exit the system. So you referenced it there a bit, but I'd like to dive a little bit deeper about what kind of services do these reentry programs really provide to formerly or soon to be not incarcerated individuals or formerly incarcerated individuals? How are they really helping these folks?
Great question. Ideally, it's tailored to the client. So if you have someone that's released and they may have had a mental health diagnosis, then your reentry support would be continuing that mental health support when they're released. They may not know what physicians take insurance or people with no insurance. So it's getting them connected to that resource. It may be for job readiness training, it may be for education, stable housing. So whatever their needs were at the time of release, it's continuing on to make sure they get those needs. It could be vocational training, physical, mental health. But I think simply said, it really helps to transition them from the needs and support of incarceration to now back to the community. And in an ideal setting, it's tailored to the individual. And so it's an endless list of the types of quote services that they'll receive. It's kind of like a general health physician. They don't have one thing that they work on, but someone can come in with any one thing from a sprained ankle to back pain. But they're going to tailor their doctor's appointment for that day to address the need of the client, the pain for that day.
I like the general physician comparison a lot, and I think it's important to note the nature of tailoring it to each individual. Well, I think there's a lot of stuff that, almost every formerly incarcerated individual will need. There's going to be a big difference between someone who's maybe in for a year or two and just needs some basic guidance for, job leads versus someone who's been in for 20 years and is going to be a lot more, lost and have a lot more gaps to fill in their potential knowledge.
I'm glad you mentioned that.
So you sort of referenced it there, but I want to go into a little bit of the why. So like, what are the situations of why these services are so needed? Why can we not just someone is released, they've served their time? Why can we not just sort of let them go and figure things out themselves? Why are these services so important?
Understood. Yes. I think one of the overarching goals is to create the stability when you're transitioning back into the community. And stability, I think it's broad, but it's the overarching goal. And stability could look like minimizing the risk for overdose, meaning, if someone was using drugs when they went in, obviously, well, hopefully they've not been able to still use drugs at that same rate when they were in custody. So oftentimes there's the mistake, for lack of better words, of using that same amount now that they're released, your body doesn't respond the same. So that's where we see a lot of overdoses immediately after release. So having those reentry supports there when they're transitioning back to the community helps to reduce the risk of overdose, definitely helps to reduce the risk of suicide. It's an acclimation. You're adjusting to being back out into a world that you may not recognize now that you're home. Things look different. Society looks different. And I think too, just immediate recidivism. So once you're back home in those short time frames, having those reentry supports are there to help mitigate the impact or the opportunity for recidivism. And ultimately, too, just the transition and acclimating back to society. Society looks different, like you said, for some of those folks who've been gone longer than maybe 1 year. So just being able to get around, wayfinding, transportation is different. We have trains now that we didn't have. It was buses when we went in. Now we may have a light rail that wasn't there before. Getting on the bus. Now the bus is all electric, not all electric. So the way that you pay may not be a dollar and a dime anymore. Now you have to pay with these certain cards or tapping your phone. So having those reentry support, simply said, it just helps individuals reacclimate back into society, and it's bringing those needs with them back into society. But the reentry supports are there to help address the need.
Yeah, I think we talked a little bit pre-show about one thing I think I didn't realize is the big like technology gap that can happen. Stuff is evolving so quickly. The fact that everything has an app now, and if you've been incarcerated for 10, 15 years, you might not even be totally familiar on how to use a smartphone properly. So being able to just having someone sort of help you with the technology gap, something as simple as that I think commonly gets missed by a lot of people, can be so big. And I think something as simple as tap to pay is something that might be missed by a lot of people, but a reentry program just helping with I want to say simple stuff, but not so simple if you're not familiar with it, right?
It is very much so. What you and I do every day as simple life, I don't want to say life skills, but for someone whose life skills have been in a incarcerated environment for X amount of years, the life skills look different on the inside than they do on the outside. So you're exactly right. Something like technology is very different. Think about when FaceTime was invented. Think about all these things that we as adult professionals now in our career, we had to adjust to with a Zoom feature on a meeting, whereas before, these were not options. And it took a little bit of a learning curve, and we stumbled sometimes and we messed it up, but then eventually we got it right. But just having, it's kind of like when we're rolling out these big TA projects, technology projects, these new software projects. The departments are putting staff in place alongside the recipients of these huge software rollouts to make sure there's people there. Similar to that same thing, when a person is not accustomed to doing the thing, having a person who's more comfortable with the thing has been shown to create a huge impact. And speaking of that, I want to shout out the organizations, and there are a few here in Washington. I think the model started in California that are using community health workers. So oftentimes, or peer navigator, oftentimes the role that's created may not be called a reentry staff or reentry case manager, but sometimes that position is called community health worker or peer navigator. And by that, they're being paired with someone oftentimes who has lived experience. They have been incarcerated. They've lived in some of those same experiences that their client has. So they're paired or assigned with someone who's a peer navigator or a community health worker. And those are the people who are helping to navigate. So in addition to having those reentry supports in place, the model that's often used is the model where it's someone who has previously walked in their shoes. So being paired with someone who has lived experience has been the ones that I've experienced to be successful.
Yeah, and I think that fits in really well. I've been doing a good amount of podcast interviews for a while now, and the lived experience factor with almost any topic any sort of support is always so big. So it's great to hear that it also applies in this area as well. And there are people out there that are using what they've learned, from a difficult situation exiting incarceration to make it a little bit easier for others. So one thing I wanted to touch on is I think a lot of our listeners and can understand, the basic concepts of reentry programs is, they help people reenter society from incarceration. But is there maybe something common about reentry programs and reentry in general that people may not realize that you'd like to highlight?
Maybe a couple of things. The need for housing and then addressing the behavioral health I think reentry supports do a good job of trying to put support or positive reinforcement in place, addressing the fact that this might be hard, and helping them to work through those feelings and experiences so that they can, quote, get it right. I think the overall goal is going to be recidivism. And so for those people who are not working in this space, we're not paying attention to how the big of the weight, the weight of something like having reentry supports in place and how it plays a role in reducing the likelihood for suicide, reducing the likelihood for overdose, reducing the likelihood for recidivism early on. So I think just shining a light on the impacts that it does create. In addition, housing. A lot of our clients come from working class communities or maybe just generational poverty. So having stable housing may not have been the case when they went in, and it likely will be questionable when they're released. And so, if nothing else, shining a light on just the attributes that come from reentry, but then the needs. So, there's always needs for reentry housing, there's always needs for funding to support the housing element, because without stable housing, it's one of those social determinants of health. There's several things that we can go down a checklist and just know that if this part is not right, look at how it spills over into other areas of our life. So I think just erasing the stigma, because I know there are stories about just transitional houses or just where do these people, quote, in society live. It's not exactly met sometimes with open arms when it comes to housing. So yes, we want them to have housing, but maybe not in my neighborhood or not too close to me. But I think just a little bit more education and awareness around what that housing can create for someone.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely, before we started this conversation, that was a blind spot for me because, in my head, I always felt like one of the biggest barriers for incarcerated individuals, and still a barrier they absolutely face, is, finding employment after release. But if you don't have stable housing, you don't have a place to take a shower, you don't have an address to list for a job application, it's really, you can't even get started in the job market. So that need for housing is so big. And you also mentioned behavioral health a little bit. Would you like to expand on that at all?
Yep, just focusing on the work that reentry is intended to do. I think there's so many other things. Yes, there's physical health, dealing with our mental health, but I think highlighting the fact that reentry also seeks to provide supports around someone's behavioral health, which was probably not addressed and may have been a contributing factor to what led you to incarceration. So if our overarching goal is to work on recidivism, reduce opportunities for recidivism, having someone with you to walk this walk and connect you to services and supports is going to help create more opportunities for success. I liken it to like a three pronged approach. Like you can't get to one before you get to two, and so just having someone there to help remind you that you have to address these needs, because a lot of times not addressing this behavior again is what put us on the fast track to incarceration in the first place. So I definitely think addressing the behaviors, and there's several programs, I can't call them all by name, but Washington, they're all connected to Washington's DOC page, but there are things like MRT, what might be the more commonly referred to, and just other programs that help to address behaviors, responses to situations. In that moment, it sounded like a good idea for me to respond or behave in the way that I did. But in society, quote, in a structured society or on rule books, that may have been a misdemeanor. Quote, spazzing out on a lady because she disrespected me or X, Y, and Z. That made sense to me in that moment. But then you're adding to increased likelihood to reoffend. So just the behavior that follows us in these situations as we're transitioning back, probably not a good situation. There was a gentleman that I remember hearing about. He was released from jail, not necessarily from prison, and there's a popular restaurant not too far away. And I don't know what happened in the restaurant that day, but he came back to custody later on that night. Like he was not even out for a full 8-hour day. He had an incident where he slapped the chip stand down at the checkout counter. So it just goes to show that there's a lot to be unpacked, about how we behave in society versus our behavior on the inside. So I think if there were some supports in place to help address these behaviors, we could see some real change when it comes to our behavioral health with the clients that we support.
Yeah, I think it sort of is. It's much different, but along the same theme of housing is if you don't have that stable base to build upon with your behavioral health or your mental health, is really has cascading effects down. And these reentry programs really try and lead them on a path or catch these potential, problems before they happen is the goal, I'd imagine.
Well said. You said it. Well said. Yes. Catch them before they happen. Yes.
So you've referenced a couple here. One thing I'd really want to hear from you as we're getting close to wrapping up here. Are there any reentry programs in Washington you'd like to shout out for doing it particularly well in either one area or in general? Obviously, we won't catch them all. We're limited on time here, but just a couple to throw out there.
Yes. So love the fact that Washington has a lot of coordinated councils. So definitely want to highlight the fact that there are some local law and justice councils, reentry councils. So there's definitely some organized support and intentional work that's happening around reentry programs. There's one specifically titled Graduated Reentry, and there's a list of services across Washington, and they have them divided up based on regions like Eastern Washington, and then there's a list on Western Washington. I do like the fact that they have reentry navigation services. So as mentioned before, like you see the peer navigators or CHWs, reentry housing assistance programs. So there's all types of things that are available. Voting rights. So just things that you and I take for granted, but having someone registered to vote or making sure they hit those, applications and reducing the stigma. Oh, if you have fill in the blank, then you cannot vote, but making sure you're following the law, not the stigma of when you are eligible to vote again. So definitely through the DOC, through the Department of Corrections, highlighting the number of community reentry programs that they have. And there's too many to name. Like there's pages of them, but definitely would redirect someone to the Department of Corrections and making sure that they follow the corrections tab because it'll pull up a wealth of resources there.
Yeah, a couple things I want to touch on there. On the Department of Corrections thing, they actually released a very nice video kind of highlighting their reentry programs for Second Chance Month, so I'll make sure to link that in the description and below the episode. And I just loved what you said there, following the law, not the stigma there. I think that is so important for reentry, and it really fits on the theme of Second Chance Month and second chances in general. Is these people have done their time, they have sort of earned their reentry into society, and not allowing stigma to create unnecessary barriers for them, I think is a great note for us to end on. So Yvonne, I would like to thank you for coming on the show and helping us learn a little bit about reentry programs and Second Chance Month in general. So that is going to wrap up our episode, and I hope you have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.